Hello again, Dr. Williams. This video will address prompt 2 for my test out, and it will regard existential theory and a multicultural feminist critique and application of the theory. So a multicultural feminist critique of existential theory would have 4 main points. The first one would be its emphasis on freedom versus the reality of systems of oppression. So existential theory is very much built on the idea that one always has the freedom and responsibility to choose no matter what the circumstances are. And that can sometimes appear tone deaf or invalidating for people for whom many choices are systemically taken away from them, particularly when the therapist has been from a non-marginalized group and has only experienced certain types of reductions of their freedom, whereas their clients may have experienced a very different type. For instance, food scarcity and healthcare disparities are some that come to mind. An existential therapist could inadvertently encourage their client from a marginalized group to take better access of things like, finding a new doctor who will really listen and understand their concerns, or really push them toward a healthier diet and lifestyle without an understanding of certain freedoms which have been systematically taken away from their client. This leads us to the second criticism, which is that existentialism can ignore basic survival needs, which are profound in the lives of some of our clients. So it tends to be a theory that's very much assuming that our survival needs are taken care of and we're able to have the luxury of thinking about our ultimate meaning, or thinking and contemplating our freedoms, and so on and so forth. And those are much more difficult to do when basic survival needs like paying the rent, staying physically safe, feeding one's family are of paramount concern. A third criticism would be that all suffering can be lumped together in existential theory, rather than a division of suffering that could be preventable and suffering that could not be preventable. So death, being one of those universal aspects, is inevitably not preventable for anybody, and existentialism treats death the same way that it treats poverty, when as something that is difficult and is a part of life, when it would be better from a multicultural perspective, at least in my opinion, to have a strict delineation between suffering that really is inevitable and suffering that really should be prevented when possible. And that leads me to my fourth criticism, which is that traditionally, existentialism has not been linked with advocacy. It has not been linked with, let's end preventable sufferings for people as much as possible. So there are some ways in which multicultural ideals could be incorporated more. One would be foundationally understanding systems of oppression in order to have a better grasp of how those are impacting people from marginalized groups. A person who really speaks to several different types of oppression would be Viktor Frankl in logotherapy, and his book, Man's Ultimate Search for Meaning, is a beautiful story, his story, about systemic oppression and racism and the way that that caused one could argue almost all of his physical freedoms to be taken from him when he became a prisoner in a Nazi prison camp. And his story can really relate to a lot of clients from marginalized backgrounds because he has suffered in many of the same ways that they have suffered. So logotherapy can be a really helpful lens for that particular problem. Another thing that logotherapy points us toward is universality. And so that would be my second suggestion for how to improve existential therapy from a multicultural perspective, focusing on things like love and death and suffering that really truly are universal. And I'd like to share a story about a time in therapy when I was able to do that to a degree, and it was really, really meaningful to me. This involved a person from a very different, a marginalized background that was very different from my own, linguistically very different from me, culturally very different from me. She was an immigrant, a very recent immigrant from Mexico, and was here without a lot of familial support. So that's one place where multicultural variables really played in, that she would typically have gotten a lot of support from her extended family, but because of her recent status coming to the States, did not have access to speaking with them about the tragedy that she was enduring at the time that I met her. She lost a child only a few days after the child had been born. She lost a child to a very difficult health circumstance. And I will mention that there was some universality involved in the sense that I have also buried a child. This was not something I chose to disclose in that session, but it was something that I felt was very meaningful in the sense that there was a universality of our experience, even though so many things were very different. But the way that existential therapy was able to be applied in her case had to do with her assignment of meaning to the way the death had taken place. She had fallen asleep with the baby in the bed with her, and she knew already at that point that the baby had a very significant health condition and was not going to live for very long. But the baby died in the night sooner than she expected, and she was just beset with guilt that she didn't wake up, that she didn't know this was going on, that she didn't try to get help to extend her baby's life a bit longer. And as we thought through and sat with that suffering, one of the things that we came to together was a curiosity about what her baby's last moments were like and what they might have been like had she gone a different direction. So asking her, I wonder what your baby experienced in those last moments of his life. And her response was, I think he experienced warmth and quiet, and he was very near me. He knew that the person who loved him most was right there. And I said, I really think so. I wonder if he could even hear your heartbeat. And she said, maybe so. Maybe a very familiar sound. And I said, I wonder how that situation would have ended differently had you realized that he was in distress and called. I wonder what would have been different in his experience. And she said, oh, it would have been lights. We would have turned on all the lights, and there would have been sounds that were probably frightening and might have been cold because he had been taken out from under my wing, and it would have been strangers that he heard and saw in his last moments. And because of that realization, she was able to gain a level of peace because she realized that her suffering in those last moments alleviated some of his. And she really assigned some meaning and had a very significant reframe of her actions. So I believe that existential therapy, although it does have some significant challenges to being applied in a multicultural context, can absolutely be a very effective therapy.